Hello friends, welcome back. In the last video we have seen about GDP, gross domestic product. That means final goods and services produced in a country. So how do we define it? How do we define GDP? So GDP means the value of final goods and services produced within country during a particular year. And here we count value of final goods and services of each sectors: primary, secondary and tertiary. So yesterday we have seen this is the definition of GDP: the value of final goods and services produced in each sector during a particular year provides the total production of the sector for the year. And some of these three sectors: primary, secondary and tertiary, that means GDP. All right. Let's see here historical change in sectors. Different sectors: primary, secondary and tertiary, three sectors contributes different values of goods and services in total number of GDP. So sometimes primary sectors gives higher share compared to secondary and tertiary, and generally today we observe tertiary is the most important. But let's see the historical changes in the importance of these sectors. Which sector is important? So first, let's talk about primary sectors. If we talk about that 200, 300 years ago, 2 or 2 centuries ago, primary sector was the most important because people depend on primary sector only. That means agriculture and related basic activities. But over the years, improvement in tools and machines as well as matter of cultivation change and improvement came. So primary sector became the important in the sense that productivity of the sector increased compared to previous years. So of course those farmers earn more than before. Those workers who were engaged there, they also got more wages compared to before. So impact of improvement in primary sector that affected secondary and tertiary sectors as well. How? Because raw material increase from primary sector. Of course, those feeder industries, primary sector is feeder. So feeder sector provided material, raw materials and other needs to secondary sector. So industries became more developed. Growth of industries that improved over the time. As well as if we talk about tertiary sector, so like transportation, administrative system, banking sector. So because of primary, secondary sector also improved. So how that secondary sector improved? That is the first shift from primary sector to secondary sector. Because of industrialization, new factories came up, new machines were invented over the time, and human labor, those were important before. Now those human labor replaced by new machines and new technology. And because of new machines and improved technology, production over the time that increased. Before, for a simple thing, if we talk about like shoes, that's a very simple thing. Before that, produced by those shoemakers, those who were expert like cobblers and other shoemakers. So it took long time. One pair of shoes sometimes took 1 month around, if expensive, if higher quality. But now, as we know that due to machines and the new improved technology, that production of shoes become that faster. So mass production became possible. That is example of shoes here, but in other sectors as well for other goods too. So due to mass production, that secondary sector became the important here. So it was the first shift from primary sector to secondary sector. But in last 100 years around, that here tertiary sector became the most important. The second shift from secondary sector to tertiary sector, because new services invented, like today we know that computer, that means internet and communication, as well as faster transportation like airways, railways. So because of such kind of services, tertiary sector has become the most important over the time. If we talk about that developed countries, so developed countries that most of the people are engaged in tertiary sector, as well as share of GDP of tertiary sector is higher than this three. So let's talk about the contribution of each sectors in GDP as well as in employment. So here there is a graph comparison of two different years, financial year 1970 and 71, 1970, 71. So from April 1970 to 31st of March 1971, and here 2010, 11. So this is the GDP of primary, secondary and tertiary sector of India during this year. Okay, so in 1970, 71, GDP was here 1 lakh crore rupees. In 1970, 71, it was 1 lakh crore rupees. Here figures are given 1 lakh 10 crore. Okay, so over the time that increase, if we talk about that 2010, 11, so increase from 10 lakh to 50 lakh crore rupees. From 10 lakh to 50 lakh crore rupees. And here color indicates share of different sector. This purple indicates tertiary sector, yellow indicates secondary sector, and green indicates primary sector. So if we compare these two, that of course in 1970-71 GDP was too low compared to this one. In compared to 2010-11, those graph showing clearly. Now, if you talk about that share, so here share that seems similar, means there is not much change during the 1971 and 2010-11 if we compare this two percentage. Same here, secondary sector share that has improved compared to previous, and tertiary sector here we can say that high jump of tertiary sector. That means in 2010-11 during this year, tertiary sector has become the most important in contribution of GDP in India. Let's see next. Share of sectors in GDP. Here previously we have seen in crore rupees. Right now in this graph, that share of each sector's percentage. So in 1970-71, share of primary sector was 45% of total GDP. 45% of total GDP. So clearly, primary sector was the most important sector during 1970-71. Next, contribution of secondary sector during the same year 1970-71, 45 to around 65. 45 to 65. So contribution of secondary sector was about 20%. 20% of total GDP, and contribution of tertiary sector was 35%. Contribution of tertiary sector was 35%. So clearly the most important sector was primary sector, then after then after tertiary sector, and last it was secondary sector. Now let's compare with the latest figures we have, latest data available to us 2010-11. 2010-11, share of primary sector merely was 15%, only 15% compared to 1970-71 when it was 45%, now only 15%. So 30% of total GDP, that lesser than previous if we talk about 40 years ago. Next year, secondary sector, which was here 20%, so increase from 20% to 15 to 35, so 30%. So improvement in secondary sector, and here this color indicates the contribution of tertiary sector, which is the use. So here contribution of tertiary sector 55% during the year 2010-11. In 2070-71, when it was merely 35%, now that the tertiary sector is become the most important sector in Indian economy, which has contribution in GDP of 55%. So let's see here. Figures are showing, data are showing why tertiary sector is the most important. There are multiple reasons behind this. In India nowadays, why tertiary sector is become most important? There are multiple reasons. So very first reason that improvement in primary sector and secondary sector leads to demand of services. That means if agriculture production increase, it demands that tertiary sector because various services are required, such as very basic. If we start, that means transportation, insurance, banking, right? Lots of services are required, and tertiary sector provides services. Same for the secondary sectors as well. Industries, development of industries leads to tertiary sectors because industries demands various services like engineer, technician, accountant, transportation, uh, communication, right, banking. So lots of services provided by tertiary sector. That is one of the reasons. Second thing that over the time, here previously we have seen that uh, GDP, which was 10 lakh crore in 1970 to 71, which hiked to 50 lakh crore. That means hike in GDP. So people's income increased over the time. Now people's life standard became better. So people began to use certain services like tourism, transportation, communication, internet, mobile phone. So those services lead demand to tertiary sector. So contribution of tertiary sector increase over the time. So those are the main reasons of tertiary sector. One more thing, that production of final goods mainly that sold through the tertiary sector. So those are the reasons why tertiary sector in India became the most important over the time. But there is one drawback. Let's see what is the drawback. Here we have seen that tertiary sector is the most important in the contribution of GDP, but at the same time, secondary and tertiary sector, mainly tertiary sector, is failed to provide employment. As we know that in development previously we have seen employment is one of the most basic aspect of economy. So let's compare this say again same two different years like 1970 71 and 2009 10. So here comparison of share of sectors in employment. Previously we have seen share in GDP, now employment same percentage. So in 1970-71, about 74% of total number of population of India were engaged in the primary sector. Earlier we have seen that people are engaged in different sector. They have different economic activities. So here in 1970-71, about 74% of total population were engaged in agriculture sector. So they were dependent on agriculture sector in which year 1970-71, and remaining population, 26% of total population, what they did, what kind of activities they did. So they were engaged in secondary and tertiary sector, it is obvious. So here 75 to 85, 10% of 74 to 85, sorry, 11% people were engaged in secondary sector, and 85 to 100, that means 15% of total population were engaged in tertiary sector during 1970-71. That means primary sector was the most important sector of the Indian economy in employment during the year 1970-71. Let's check the figure. Let's check the data of recent. That means 2010-11. So in 2010-11, 54% of total population were engaged in agriculture sector. Still, the agriculture sector is the most important in terms of employment. But yes, if we compare with the 1970-71, that number of population increased. So around 24% of people, where did they move? So they moved to secondary and tertiary sector. So 55 to 74%, 55 to 74%. That means 18% of people are engaged here in secondary sector, and here 74 to 7%. That means 26% of population engaged in tertiary sector. Previously, we have seen that tertiary sector has a huge contribution in GDP, but this tertiary sector has failed to provide employment in India, because today more than 54% of population are engaged in agriculture sector. So here we can see that tertiary sector became the important in terms of GDP, contribution in GDP. But unlike the developed countries, tertiary sector in India failed to provide employment, because today we know that most of the people are engaged in agriculture work. Uh, they have work in their field, more sometimes more than people required that those people engage in agriculture work. Sometimes they just help other people in agriculture sector. So condition of employment in agriculture sector, condition of unemployment in India, we'll discuss in next video. See you soon. Thank you so much. Take care.